lot of people, especially today, ascribe power that isn't there to the Israel lobby because of anti-Semitic canards. What really matters to the American government, what really matters to the politicians and the officials who are making these decisions are hard American interests. Frankly, it doesn't matter to us all that much if there are gay pride parades in Tel Aviv and if Israel is a liberal democratic society. It really matters to us whether it's aligned with us.
This episode of Think Twice is sponsored by the Jewish Future Promise, ensuring a vibrant and thriving future for Jews and Israel. And now a word about our sponsors. At the heart of the Jewish people is a promise that ensures our traditions, values, and future endure for generations. The Jewish Future Promise is a movement I endorse. It is a moral commitment to securing that future. By signing the promise, we commit to keeping Jewish life vibrant and thriving for the next generation. Join me in shaping the future. Make your promise today. Sign the promise, jewishfuturepromise.org/sign the promise. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. This week we have an interesting and timely conversation for you with Daniel Samet, the author of a new book about U.S. defense policy towards Israel during the Cold War that gives us a great deal of insight not only about this piece of history, but how we should think about the relationship between the two countries today. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, you still don't have to wait a full week for more of our content. There is a Jonathan Tobin Daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. The U.S.-Israel relationship never seems to be far from the headlines or the center of the discussion about what is happening around the world. But for all of its centrality to the debates about global issues, it may be among the least understood topics about U.S. foreign policy. At the heart of this misunderstanding are some key myths that are often promoted by Israel's friends as well as its foes in the United States. Many Americans, including those who are the most educated and interested in the issue, believe that the reasons why America supports Israel have mainly to do with sentiment and lobbying. Those who back Israel will often say that it is the common values of democracy and the roots of Western civilization that is what unites the two countries. They see American sympathy for Israel because of what happened during the Holocaust or the religious beliefs of Christians, as well as Jews, are the foundations of the alliance. While Israel's friends laud these factors, Israel's detractors, from the birth of the Jewish state until now, have also often acknowledged them, even if ruefully. Enemies of Israel, though, prefer to speak of the alliance as mostly the result of an all-powerful Israel lobby, a phrase first made popular by scholars Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer in their 2007 bestseller of the same name. Since then, the notion that the lobby rules Washington has been taken up by left-wing Democrats like Representatives Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who speak of the Benjamins, or the $100 bills given as contributions to buy the loyalty of members of Congress and even administrations, being the only reason why America backs the Jewish state. This toxic notion also has been strangely echoed by some supporters who like to laud the efforts of the pro-Israel lobby AIPAC. Such sentiment is real in a country where backing for Zionism dates back to the earliest years of the Republic, as well as being rooted in evangelical Christianity. And AIPAC and other pro-Israel groups do their best to promote support for the Jewish state. But both explanations are, for the most part, wrong. From the first days of the existence of the modern state of Israel to the present, U.S. policy towards it has always been primarily motivated by one thing above all, the interests of the United States. Israel is treated as an ally and strategic partner because doing so helps America. Any honest reading of that history during the last 77 years shows that, indeed, in its earliest years, during the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, when Israel was at its most vulnerable and most in need of assistance, it got nothing from the Americans, simply because, regardless of Truman's sympathy and Ike's indifference, if not hostility, it was perceived as too weak to be of any real help to American strategic interests and efforts to fend off Soviet incursions in the region. That only began to change in the 1960s under the Kennedy administration, when for the first time the U.S. began to sell some arms, and was only truly reversed after the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel's impressive victory and acquisition of the territory that made it less vulnerable transformed it into a strategic asset rather than being seen as nothing but a liability. The relationship thrived and folded for the rest of the Cold War, not so much because of the personal feelings of American presidents, but because of how they saw the world and Israel's ability to advance Americans' goals. That also continues to this day. Just as important, the notion of the all-powerful Israel lobby is also a myth, because it has lost as many battles as it has won, even under friendly administrations. Other D.C. lobbies, such as those of various industries or political causes, have much better win-loss records. In the end, pragmatism rather than pure sentiment may actually be to Israel's benefit, since a realistic approach to the Middle East, such as the one championed by President Donald Trump, has led to the greatest closeness between the two nations, and more than any of its predecessors. And given the stakes in the current war, Israel's fighting against Hamas terrorists and their Iranian paymasters and other Tehran proxies, understanding these facts may be more important than ever. Someone who has a profound understanding of these issues is scholar and author Daniel Samet, and we're fortunate to have him with us today. Daniel Samet is the George P. Shultz Fellow at the Ronald Reagan Institute. He previously worked for Senator Tom Cotton, the Atlantic Council, and the National Endowment for Democracy. He's also been a Krauthammer Fellow at the Tikva Fund and a Graduate Fellow at the Rumsfeld Foundation. His writing has appeared in National Review, Commentary, The Wall Street Journal, and other publications. Daniel Samet, welcome to Think Twice.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Well, Daniel, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about the reason you wrote this book. There's a large body of literature about the U.S.-Israel relationship, but also a great deal of misunderstandings about it. What is it that most people, really on both sides of the divide about Israel, don't understand about the alliance?
There are two main reasons why I wrote this book. The first was a practical one. I was recently a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin, for which I had to write a dissertation. The dissertation I then turned into this full-length book, which came out last month now in April. The second was a more scholarly reason. In 2007, as you probably remember, Jonathan, there was a book that came out that made quite a splash, both in the scholarly and popular world. It was entitled The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. The authors of that book were John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, both of whom are very well regarded in the international relations community. But their book did not endear them, shall we say, to the pro-Israel community. What they contended in that book, which came out 18 years ago now, was that there was a powerful Israel lobby, a pro-Israel lobby, that was driving U.S. Mideast policy in ways injurious to American interests. They write in the book that American politicians are very deferential to Israel because of this Israel lobby and the political power it holds. Going into my PhD, I was skeptical of that argument. I thought that they were dramatically overstating the power of the pro-Israel lobby, and I wanted to test that hypothesis of mine against the evidence. To do that, I spent a lot of time in archives, in presidential libraries, in congressional papers, going through the U.S. government sources in an attempt to answer the question of why, for many decades now, has the United States maintained a security partnership with Israel. My conclusion was pretty simple. American interests, which I define as American security, American prosperity, and American liberty, were the driving force behind U.S. policy. Domestic politics, on the other hand, played a very, very minor role in the making of American policies. There are a lot of misconceptions out there about this. I think even people who are sympathetic to a strong U.S.-Israel security partnership impute to the pro-Israel lobby much more power than it actually has. And I can tell you with high confidence that after spending a lot of time with literally thousands of U.S. government documents and doing interviews with former U.S. policymakers, that the Israel lobby has very little influence. What matters much more are hard, strategic, national interests. That's what really matters. And that's the main misconception I wanted to fight in writing this book.
Yeah, and I think during the course of your book, which focuses on the Cold War era, from Truman to the first President George Bush, you kind of bears out because it's always about strategic interests. And that's true whether the president and his administration are particularly friendly to Israel or not that friendly to Israel. And it's very, and critics of Israel, particularly State Department foes of the alliance from 1948 to the present, have often derided support for the Jewish state as sort of rooted in sentiment rather than interests. But in addition to that not being the best explanation for pro-Israel moves by various administrations, haven't the arguments against Israel always been that same mix of sentiment, albeit in the form of hostility to Jews in their state, and perceive interest as the ones in favor of it? Weren't the Arabists in the State Department the ones not thinking clearly about how best to stop the Soviet Union rather than the Friends of Israel?
I largely agree with that point, Jonathan. It's funny you mentioned the emotional side of things. George Ball, who was a prominent official in the Department of State, wrote a book, I think this was with his son, entitled The Passionate Attachment, which was a criticism of the U.S.-Israel partnership and made the argument that this was driven by emotions, much less so hard interests. He wanted U.S. policy to go in a different direction. And it is true that a lot of the time, the argument for closer relations with the Arab states did rest on emotion. I'm going to give you one example that I try to get into in the book. This has to do with Egypt, which for many years, the United States wanted to turn into a partner. This was in the Cold War context. Perhaps some of your viewers might not know this. Before President Anwar Sadat, who was the president who actually made peace with Israel, there was a violently anti-Israel president named Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was very charismatic, was the leading figure in the Arab world for many years, and was implacably, hostile to the Jewish state. The American government, under Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy, really wanted to cozy up to this leader in Egypt. They thought that they could bring him into the American sphere of influence.
Right, wean him away from the Soviet Union, most principally, right?
Yes, and this was a high-stakes game because the Soviet Union was attempting to make inroads in the Middle East. The Americans did not want that. They wanted to keep the Soviets on the sidelines as much as possible because every country that was in the Soviet camp was one country that was not in the American camp, and that was very bad for American interests. They were making all sorts of overtures to Nasser in hopes that he would somehow reverse course, be weaned off of Soviet assistance and toward American assistance. Eisenhower thought this. That was the principal reason why he sided with Nasser's Egypt against the British, the French, and the Israelis in 1956 during the Suez Crisis when those three powers had invaded Egypt. Eisenhower exerted a lot of pressure on them to get out because, again, he wanted to curry favor with Nasser. Kennedy hewed to a similar line, and it was only under President Johnson, Kennedy's successor, that the Americans were largely disabused of the illusion that Nasser would somehow be won over. Johnson came to see Nasser for what he truly was, which was an anti-American dictator who, under no acceptable circumstances, could ever be brought into the American camp. The emotional argument lost in favor of a practical argument for a partnership with Israel based on Realpolitik, based on hard strategic interests.
Yeah, and I think you even note, although that's not the principal argument that you make, that some of it was just hostility to Israel, hostility to Jews. You note in passing in your book but which really, caught my eye, that one of the, the great strategic thinkers of American foreign policy in the post-war era, George Kennan. If you're a student of American foreign policy, he's a key name. But he really was anti-Semitic, and he was among those who was always arguing against closer relations with Israel.
Precisely. On one hand, Kennan is a towering figure in U.S. foreign policy. He's revered, largely rightly so, for driving some of those early policies of containment against the Soviet Union. On the other hand, he had a lot of retrograde views about Jews in particular, and this really comes out in a new biography of Kennan, and we're learning more and more as we have more documents. Another figure, if I may, who also had a complex relationship with Jews, to put it lightly, was President Nixon. I wouldn't go so far as to call him an anti-Semite. There's no question, based on the historical record, that he said a lot of things that were prejudiced against Jews, lots of slights.
Caught on tape.
Caught on tape, yes. Written in the press. Henry Kissinger, who was his national security advisor, was often on the receiving end of a lot of this verbal abuse. It couldn't have been pleasant for Kissinger. That said, Nixon also had policies that were quite friendly toward the Jewish state.
Absolutely. I want to get into Nixon a little later, once we go through, sort of the history. But before we do, I think before we delve more into the history of the relationship, let's dive back into this myth of the all-powerful Israel lobby, which is, very important to this whole argument. Hasn't it, you refer to it as much of a paper tiger, really, as a DC, monster. Why are so many people so ready to believe the talk about the Benjamins, Ilhan Omar's, anti-Semitic comment determining U.S. policy? Has there ever been an American administration that really backed Israel because of politics rather than policy? And that goes back to the beginning, from Truman to the present day.
I found no evidence whatsoever to bear out the claim that an American administration implemented policies favorable to Israel because of the pro-Israel lobby. That is not borne out by the facts that I consulted. It's not true. I think a lot of people, especially today, ascribe power that isn't there to the Israel lobby because of anti-Semitic canards. They think that Jews are working deviously behind the scenes to pull the strings of power. A lot of people think that Jews run Washington, Jews control the government, Jews run the United States, Jews run the world. Those canards are still there. A curious thing, though, is, unbeknownst to a lot of those people, the pro-Israel lobby, in addition to being heavily Jewish, is also heavily Christian. Christian Zionists, I think, far outnumber Jewish Zionists in this country. And also there is, I don't mean to fault AIPAC and organizations like it, but if you are in advocacy, you have an incentive to inflate your own influence because the business of advocacy is to shape policy. And if you can't demonstrate that you are shaping policy, in fact, if the facts actually say that you are having no impact whatsoever on policy, then why would people support your organization? It doesn't make sense. You have an interest in saying that you are more powerful than you actually are. My work is not a work of advocacy. It is a work of scholarship. I'm trying as faithfully as I can to recount the facts as I assembled them and tell a coherent story that is rooted in the historical evidence. That was my primary aim in writing this book.
Yeah, and I think, you don't have to be a scholar, as you are, of this particular piece of history to understand that every time that AIPAC has gone toe-to-toe with a U.S. president, it's always lost. That goes back to Jimmy Carter with the sale of planes to the Saudis. Ronald Reagan, who was a great friend of Israel, also went toe-to-toe with AIPAC, with the pro-Israel community, and beat them down when it came to selling AWACS and command and control planes to the Saudis in the early 80s, which was a huge battle. And even not going back all that far, it was 10 years ago now, it seems like, less than that, when the entire pro-Israel community went to the mat to stop President Obama's appeasement of Iran and his Iran nuclear deal. And yet, Obama won. He won it rather easily. AIPAC always loses. AIPAC has certainly influence. It has, enabled sort of aid to Israel. It hasn't. It's not a complete. It's not a fraud. I mean, it has helped engender a lot of support for Israel. But that's largely because Israel's popular, not because AIPAC are such geniuses, isn't it?
Precisely, Jonathan. Those three examples you cite are, in my view, eminently representative of the impotence of the pro-Israel lobby. Let me say a few brief things about each one. The 1978 sale under the Carter administration, which you cite, involved the sale of warplanes to not only the Israelis, but also the Egyptians and the Saudis. AIPAC would rather the sale go through only to the Israelis and not the Saudis and the Egyptians, both of which the pro-Israel lobby did not trust. Carter administration didn't care. They pressed ahead with the package anyway. Carter, in his diary, or his memoirs, I can't remember, actually called that sale a big defeat for the pro-Israel lobby. Let's fast forward 3 years to 1981. You mentioned this. This was the AWACS sale to Saudi Arabia under the Reagan administration. The pro-Israel lobby, and AIPAC in particular, came out guns blazing against this sale. They did not want advanced reconnaissance technology in the hands of Riyadh. They really went to the mat in Congress to try to get this sale killed there. They succeeded in the House of Representatives. The House, well, I shouldn't say they succeeded. The House of Representatives voted to kill the sale resoundingly, but the Reagan administration pulled out all the stops. They lobbied the Senate heavily to vote with the administration, and after strenuous effort, the Senate voted by a 52-48 margin with the president, and the sale was assured. Bottom line, the pro-Israel lobby failed. Mearsheimer and Waltz, in their book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, mention the 81 AWACS sale, and they concede that the pro-Israel lobby lost, but they said it was a result of something along the lines of unusually favorable conditions, something along those lines. My view is this was not the exception. This was the rule. The lobby loses on practically every major question in the U.S.-Israel relationship I can think of. That in more contemporary times, we had the Iran deal under the Obama administration. The Israel lobby, the pro-Israel lobby, was uniformly opposed to this agreement. The administration says, thanks for your input. Sorry, we're going forward anyway. It didn't have any effect.
Yeah, that's always the way it's been. Now, if we look back to the beginning of the U.S.-Israel relationship since 1948, the founding of the modern state of Israel, I think a lot of people, friends as well as foes of Israel, have this idea that the United States has always been generous with aid to Israel, but that isn't true at all. And isn't it that this is proved by the way that both President Harry Truman, who was sympathetic to the Jewish state and he's lauded by friends of Israel and Jews for recognizing it after within a few minutes of its birth, and President Dwight Eisenhower, who was not friendly to Israel, neither of them really did pretty much anything for Israel during that entire period.
The idea that the United States has always provided military aid, in particular to Israel, is demonstrably untrue. It was only in the Kennedy administration that aid was provided in any significant amounts. Let me talk about Truman and Eisenhower both pretty quickly. Truman, as you mentioned, was sympathetic to Israel and the Jewish people. He famously recognized the state of Israel only 11 minutes into its existence, overriding the desires of many, many people in his administration. That's pretty much where the story stops in terms of his policies favorable to Israel. There was economic aid that was given to Israel, I believe, under Truman and Eisenhower, but there was really no military aid to speak of. The idea behind this was making sure there was no war in the Middle East. The U.S. government feared a regional conflagration in which the Soviets could step in and benefit. And to avert such a possibility, the administration wanted to arm neither the Israelis nor the Arabs. It was best to stay out. If we give them weapons, it'll be provocative. That could lead to war. We don't want war. We want stability.
Yeah,
Truman, yes.
Yeah, I mean, the point is Israel's war of independence was won with check arms, that were allowed by the Soviet Union to be sold to be given to Israel. There was an arms embargo on Israel from the United States at that time, but that's often forgotten.
Yes, it was an arms embargo. And Truman was, as I mentioned, sentimentally attached. There's a rather moving anecdote of a meeting between Truman and Ben-Gurion, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion tells Truman, I would not deign to try to place your place in American history, but I can say with certainty that you will go down as a towering figure in Jewish history. And Truman reportedly got very emotional and he had tears in his eyes upon hearing that remark. But even so, despite his, you could say, sentimental attachment to Israel, he didn't sell weapons because strategic logic dictated otherwise. This was also the case under Eisenhower, who shared very little, if any, of Truman's sentimentality when it came to Israel. He was much colder in his view. The strategic logic was pretty much the same. We can't sell weapons to either side in this conflict. We've got to keep the Soviets out. Oh, and by the way, there's this new guy, Nasser, whom we're trying to court. And if we get closer to the Israelis, it's going to make it harder for us to court Nasser, who's a sworn enemy of Israel and the Jewish people. That's not going to happen. It was a cold calculation along national security lines. We can't sell either side weapons of significance. We've got to stay out. The Israelis do want our weapons, but too bad for them. We've got to do what's right for our country, and that means we're not going to sell them any weapons of significance. Yeah,
I mean, that's entirely true. It's really forgotten that not only was, Israel's 1956 participation in the 1956 Suez War, or the Sinai War, as the Israelis called it, or the 1967 Six-Day War, those were fought with French weapons. There wasn't that much in the way of American, even after the United States started to sell weapons to Israel. This was not the main. The United States was not Israel's main military ally. But let me ask you, why did about how that started to change? The relationship first began to change when John Kennedy became president. What was it that why was Kennedy ready to do something that Truman and Johnson were not ready to do?
Two main reasons, in my view. The first had to do with Kennedy himself. He, unlike Eisenhower, was very sympathetic to Israel. He spoke very warmly about Israel, the Jewish people, and Israelis themselves. It was a much closer relationship, personality-wise, than what had happened under the prior administration. I can't discount that at all. The second had to do with U.S. national security. There was increasing evidence that the Arabs, principally the Egyptians and the Syrians, were getting lots of advanced weapons from the Soviet bloc, Soviet planes and weapons like that. They posed a big threat to Israel. The U.S. government recognized this after it became impossible to pretend otherwise. Kennedy, a few years into his administration, toward the end of 1962, after studying the evidence and after hearing from his subordinates that Israel really required these weapons, American weapons, to neuter the threat, to deter attacks by the Arabs, that he had to go ahead and sell them weapons. The weapon he decided to sell the Israelis was the Hawk surface-to-air missile. It was a very advanced anti-aircraft missile that the Israelis wanted from the United States. Kennedy decided that national security considerations required that he sell them the weapon because the Israelis needed it to deter attacks by the Soviet-armed Arabs.
Yeah, and that was a defensive weapon, though.
It was
did not give Israel the ability to attack. The real breakthrough towards a strategic relationship, which many people now take for granted, occurred during the Lyndon Johnson administration, but after, rather than before the 1967 Six-Day War. How did that victory help establish the argument that Israel was a strategic asset to the United States rather than, as many people believed then, and as well as now, a liability.
Many people do not know this, and I don't think I realized this until I read Michael Oren's book on the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War was won largely with French weapons, not American weapons. Those were the arms that got the job done for the Israelis, Mirage planes and arms like that. The Six-Day War is a stunning success for Israel. They destroy the entire Egyptian Air Force. They run roughshod over the Egyptians, the Syrians, and the Jordanians. They claim a ton of territory in the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and they emerge a true regional power for the first time. It was an impressive victory, and it was impossible for the United States government to conclude otherwise. From Johnson's perspective, he wanted to partner with strong states around the world. Your viewers might recall that he was getting increasingly bogged down in Vietnam. This was 1967, 1 year before the calamitous year of 1968 in the Tet Offensive. He wanted things to be easy in other theaters. He wanted to work with strong, powerful states who could help the United States so he could focus on Vietnam and then his domestic agenda too. Israel had proven itself a very strong partner. It had defeated its Arab foes that many thought would actually defeat the Arabs instead, and that was impressive. Also making this an easy choice for Johnson was the fact that Nasser was not getting any closer to the United States. The evidence was undeniable. He was a Soviet client. That wasn't going to change. Johnson, after a few years, concluded the obvious. He's not going to change. He's not going to come to us. He's going to stay with the Soviets. Therefore, we can get closer and closer to the Israelis without suffering any repercussions because Egypt really isn't going to come to us no matter what we do, and it's foolish to pretend otherwise. All those reasons led Johnson to double down on the strategic relationship that Kennedy had really initiated. Johnson took it to new heights.
Yeah, and I think it's a basic principle of finance as well as strategic policy. When Israel was fighting for its life in 1948, and in fact in the 1950s, very weak and a very poor country, the United States did not view it as any kind of an asset. It was, the arguments from the State Department to Arabis that it was a liability seemed reasonable, even to those who were sympathetic to Israel. But once Israel becomes a regional superpower and has this amazing victory, then all of a sudden the United States, oh yeah, well, you can have whatever you want. That's the irony here. Just as, if you're broke, banks won't lend you a dime, but if you have plenty of money, they're glad to lend you more. That's the basic myth about the U.S.-Israel relationship. It's always strongest when Israel is strong.
No question about that, Jonathan. Netanyahu, in his relatively new memoir, makes a point. I remember he has some line to the effect of, power attracts, weakness repels. It's as simple as that. Yep. If you're a kid in the playground when you're 5 years old, you want to be strong, not weak. The same for the international system. Much better to have power than have little power.
This episode of Think Twice is sponsored by the Jewish Future Promise, ensuring a vibrant and thriving future for Jews and Israel. And now a word about our sponsors. At the heart of the Jewish people is a promise that ensures our traditions, values, and future endure for generations. The Jewish Future Promise is a movement I endorse. It is a moral commitment to securing that future. By signing the promise, we commit to keeping Jewish life vibrant and thriving for the next generation. Join me in shaping the future. Make your promise today. Sign the promise, jewishfuturepromise.org/sign the promise. Yeah, now Johnson is then succeeded by Richard Nixon, whom you've already told us, and I think it's part of this historical memory, along with Watergate, that Nixon had a lot of, that was prone to anti-Semitism, but it's his administration seems to be the one that best illustrates the way that talk about values and sympathy don't explain the alliance. Though I think it's clear that Nixon did as much for Israel as any president right up until Trump, principally because of his actions during the Yom Kippur War. His personal feelings about Israel and the Jews didn't figure into his policy. And it's equally true that the man who ran his foreign policy, Henry Kissinger, was, despite being Jewish, not, a great Zionist. If you read Neil Ferguson's, first volume of what will hopefully be a multi-volume biography, he came from Jews who were specifically anti-Zionist. That wasn't how he was raised. And yet Nixon and Kissinger really do help save Israel during the crisis after Yom Kippur in 1973.
Nixon is a fascinating character in American political history, full of contradictions, brilliant, calculating, but also very cynical and petty. An enigma of a man. When it came to Israel, you're right, he was prone to certainly anti-Semitic remarks. At the same time, he had a really strong rapport with Prime Minister Golda Meir, perhaps the strongest rapport between any American president and any Israeli prime minister that I came across in this book. They were very close. They had a warm rapport. The press recognized this. Nixon wrote about this in his own writings. And Meir also credited Nixon with being a figure pretty supportive of the Jewish state. At the same time, Nixon...
What caused that, do you think? I mean, we don't want to get too bogged down into it, but they were not two people that you would think would be friends. She's sort of this Jewish grandmother, although somebody, certainly an American who spoke American English. How did they bond?
I don't know. It's a great question. I don't have a complete answer.
Because it's not like the traditional answers about, common values and commonality and all the high-flown rhetoric. Was it just that they were two tough politicians who sort of saw each other as kindred spirits in some way?
I think that's it. I think they both respected each other's strength. Nixon had come back from the political wilderness by winning in 1968 after having lost in 1960. Meir respected that. Nixon respected Meir's undoubted strength. You can't be a female head of government without being really, really tough. This is before Thatcher came to prominence. Nixon respected that because you couldn't overlook it. It was undeniable. I think that's pretty much it. Ideologically, they were not similar. Meir was on the left, Nixon was on the right. But in fact, if you look at American presidents and Israeli prime ministers who were similar ideologically, I'm thinking of Ronald Reagan and Menachem Begin, and his successor, George H.W. Bush and Menachem Begin, and Yitzhak Shamir, on the Israeli side, the relationships were often very strained. Ideological common ground was no guarantee.
They didn't really like each other at all. I mean,
no, they matched very poorly.
Yeah, not as hostile as the relationship between Jimmy Carter and Menachem Begin, and I want to get to Carter in a moment, but the matchup between the two leaders, which is always a fractious down to this day, as we've seen, as Prime Minister Netanyahu has to navigate through the Trump administration, the first term and now the second. Again, it's about common interests. It's not about sentiment. It's not about the usual rhetoric we always hear about that unites Israel and the United States.
Yes, let me say this about Kissinger briefly.
Mm-hmm. Please.
I'd rather we not be too unfair to Kissinger, given not just because he just passed away, but given that he was an exceptional figure in U.S. foreign policy. And I think on this question, on the U.S.-Israel relationship, he's been unfairly maligned. I'm sure you want to talk about October 73, Jonathan, mm-hmm. But before that, I want to say that Kissinger was the ultimate practitioner of Realpolitik, meaning interests above values. Regardless of his personal feelings, I think he did this pretty well. He was relatively unemotional when it came to U.S. national security, U.S. foreign policy. Nixon was the same way. And if you think the U.S.-Israel partnership has been a net benefit to the United States, which I do, and I would imagine you and your viewers agree, then you have to credit Kissinger because he mostly Nixon, but also Kissinger, saved it in its hour of greatest need in October 73 and kept the security partnership going despite Nixon's anti-Semitic inclinations and Kissinger's complex views towards Israel. They made sure it didn't falter and it didn't lose. That was no small thing.
Yeah, I think the disconnect is, between how people thought then, especially within the Jewish community, and how sort of it stands up to the historical record. At the time, Kissinger was viewed as insufficiently pro-Israel, given that he was Jewish by many Jews. Part of that context was also his attitude and that of the Nixon administration to the cause of freedom for Soviet Jewry, to which both Nixon and especially Kissinger were clearly indifferent. I mean, he clearly, prioritized détente with the Soviet Union at a time when Jewish activists were really gearing up to try to gain the freedom of Soviet Jews. So I think there was certainly a perception within American Jewry, organized American Jewry, as well as most Jews, that Kissinger was not a friend to Israel, and they regarded his pressure on Israel to sort of agree to ceasefires, to not have a clear-cut victory at the end of the Yom Kippur War as hostility. But in the end, it kind of worked out, not only because the strategic partnership was preserved, but because, Kissinger's ultimate goal of gaining a peace between Israel and Egypt actually succeeded, although not under, while he was in office.
It did. And let's contrast very briefly the indifference to the plight of the refuseniks under Nixon and Kissinger to the Reagan administration. And I am at the Ronald Reagan Institute, after all. Ronald Reagan prioritized this in his discussions with Soviet apparatchiks. He would always, almost invariably, bring up the plight of Natan, then known as Anatoly Sharansky, and other Jewish dissidents. He made this a central pillar of his approach to the Soviet Union, despite his desire to strike deals on arms control and that sort of thing. He put this front and center, and he was able to get concessions from the Soviets on the refuseniks and other dissidents because of his relationship, I think, with those leaders. Whereas Nixon and Kissinger wanted nothing to do with the refuseniks. They thought that would impinge on progress in détente, and that, for them, was the all-encompassing goal. Yeah,
and then sort of the White House tapes, which we remember clearly, Nixon's White House tapes, which we remember principally because of Watergate. There's one terrible quote from Kissinger where he was saying he basically wouldn't care what the Russians did to the Jews. He was like, if they were going to kill them all, that didn't really move him. One would hope that's not what he really thought. But it was, and that it was somewhat performative for Nixon's sake. But yet, he really didn't care about that issue, and that was something that grated against American Jews at the time, and in which there was a point of disagreement with Reagan, even during the 1976 presidential campaign, when Reagan was running against Nixon's successor Gerald Ford, whose foreign policy and much of the administration was being orchestrated by Kissinger as well.
Yes, that one quote from Nixon, I don't recall it exactly, but as you say, it was something to the effect of many thousands, if not millions, of Jews could be gassed in the Soviet Union, and it would be of no importance to U.S. foreign policy. And Kissinger agreed either for performative reasons or as an intellectual exercise. We don't know. It wasn't a great look for Kissinger.
Although he would come, as I'm sure you're steeped in his post government writings, he always said that the thing about American foreign policy is that although it must be rooted in strategic interests, it has to have a touch of idealism for Americans to actually support it, because he came to that conclusion after the fact, not while he was in power.
Yes, we're an ideals, values-driven people, after all.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we could probably devote an entire program to Jimmy Carter and his issues with Israel, his issues with Jews, and never mind just Menachem Begin. But he was someone who was clearly hostile to Israel. Was his sympathy for the Palestinians about U.S. interests? Or was it really about, his own ideological goals and sentiments, which were not really in line with U.S. interests?
one can't say for sure. My reading on it is, even though he sympathized deeply with the Palestinians, he saw himself as a champion of the oppressed. The Palestinians certainly fit into that category. His main concern was an Arab-Israeli settlement. Mm-hmm. He worked tirelessly, the rest of his administration did too, to bring one to fruition. He thought the Israelis were intransigent, they were being difficult, they were uncompromising. He didn't like them personally, and he also thought that they were throwing a wrench into U.S. foreign policy in being so obdurate in negotiations.
I think we should point out that he didn't like Yitzhak Rabin or Menachem Begin. It wasn't just that he didn't like Begin, although he certainly didn't like Begin.
It didn't matter if the leader was on the left or the right. Carter didn't get along with either. The Palestinians, I think, from the perspective of Carter and American foreign policy, were clear evidence for Israeli misdeeds in the eyes of Carter. Not only were they oppressing them in the West Bank and Gaza and elsewhere, but
or as he perceived them to be.
Yes, as he perceived them to be. But they were also a reason why the Israelis and Arab states couldn't come to an agreement on peace, namely the Egyptians and the Syrians, the Jordanians. He thought that if there could be some sort of grand bargain, some concert, Middle Eastern concert, then that would redound to American interests, which I think is true and was a laudable goal. But in the process, he went about exerting a lot of pressure on the Israelis, often in counterproductive ways. He successfully blocked some of their arms sales in Latin America. He was rhetorically, he had a lot of tough things to say about the Israelis in public. All that was not salutary. But to his credit, he and his administration did orchestrate the Camp David Accords and the subsequent Israel-Egypt peace treaty.
Although we should note that the Sadat visit to Jerusalem happened in spite of Carter, not because of Carter. In fact, because he was worried about Jimmy Carter bringing the Soviets back into the peace process. So he kind of that was handed to Carter, but it was not because of any great vision on his part.
That is true. I can tell, Jonathan, you're loath to give Carter any credit whatsoever.
I'll give it. Listen, he did broker the Camp David agreement, but it wouldn't have had it been up to him. They wouldn't have gotten there.
True. And from the American perspective, this was really a no-brainer. We've got to bring Egypt and Israel together. If they make peace, that's great. Oh, and by the way, Egypt is also going to become an American partner as opposed to a Soviet partner. And that is great for us. They are in our camp, not the Soviet camp. And as a price for this agreement, it will sell them weapons, which is fine with us. They'll become our client, not the Soviet client. It's a win-win. Yeah,
and let's point out, Anwar Sadat wanted an alliance with the United States. He wanted peace with Israel. He had to pay lip service to the Palestinians. But Carter was much more interested in the Palestinians ultimately than Sadat was, wasn't he?
He was. It was a preoccupation of Carter's. Of course, he had that book in 2006, I want to say, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, that was like the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy, slammed both by people inside the pro-Israel lobby and outside. I think that book was really beyond the pale, like the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy. Carter certainly was hostile to Israel and sympathetic to the Palestinians. There's no question about that. Sadat, on the other hand, I think is, maybe I wouldn't say a heroic figure, but deserves a lot of credit for his overtures to Israel and for making peace with it. And in 1981, he was assassinated as a result of those overtures. Unlike Nasser died of a heart attack in 1970, but Sadat actually paid for that with his life, which was no small thing and is certainly a sad detail
and
in
tragic.
This episode.
Absolutely.
Very tragic.
Let's get to the Reagan era. It was really only under Reagan that the relationship with Israel began to be widely acknowledged as a strategic partnership. And it was an era of real warmth that went beyond what had come before. But that didn't mean that there weren't some bitter fights with pro-Israel forces during his 8 years of the presidency. And those were bitter fights, as we've already acknowledged, that the pro-Israel forces consistently lost.
Very bitter fights. In fact, perhaps the bitterest fights of any administration that I studied in this book, strategic cooperation, as you say, did reach new heights under Reagan. There were two agreements, one at the beginning of Reagan's presidency and one at the end, that solidified and formalized this relationship. I'm working with a limited number of declassified sources, but I can tell you it is clear that the Israelis and the Americans were working hand in glove to combat shared threats. The Americans helped the Israelis modernize their Navy, for one. There were regular consultations between American strategists and Israeli strategists. That is beyond dispute. When it comes to the bitter fights, of which there were many, I'll start with June of 1981, when Israel, as you know, Jonathan, bombed Iraq's nuclear reactor, the Osirak reactor, much to the surprise of the Reagan administration. The fear in the Reagan administration was that in taking out this reactor and attacking Iraq preemptively, there could be a regional war in the Middle East, and Israel could have offered the spark that set off a fire that could not be extinguished. To show its displeasure with Israel, the Reagan administration put a hold on the transfer of 4 F-16s to the Israelis. The Israelis, after all, had used American planes on the raid against Iraq, and also supported a resolution condemning Israel at the United Nations. This runs contrary to what we assume about the United States and Israel at the UN. The United States, though it has almost always backed Israel at the UN, from the vilest to most vile anti-Israel legislation imaginable, actually sided with the rest of the world at the Security Council when it came to condemning this raid. Those were pretty punitive measures. Mm-hmm. And I'm happy to get into other points of friction if you want. That's just one.
The irony there, and it's an important one, is that, of course, had Israel not taken that step, the history of the following decade, especially during the Gulf War, might have been very, very different. And I think most American leaders, whether they were that in love with Israel or not, eventually came to acknowledge that Israel had been right and the United States was wrong about that.
Yes, today it would be hard to find a serious person in the U.S. government, even one critical of Israel, who thought that was a bad idea in hindsight. It was clearly the right move, and it did us a favor in the long run. There's no doubt about that.
Now, if we're going to talk about the history of the U.S.-Israel alliance, there are some key sore points that can't be ignored. One is the bombing of the USS Liberty during the Six-Day War. But I don't want to ignore the Jonathan Pollard affair either, and I think that still resonates. How much damage did he do to the alliance? And this was during this period when things were getting very close under Reagan. And why do you think it is that many supporters of Israel continue to, as I think, foolishly regard him as a hero, rather than someone who obviously did more harm than good for both Israel and American Jews?
I'll speak from the American perspective. I'm American, not Israeli. I imagine most of your listeners fall into that camp too. Pollard is not a sympathetic figure whatsoever in my eyes. He was a naval intelligence officer and not a high-ranking one at that. And we know for sure, because I think the Israelis have actually admitted this, the Israeli government paid him to spy on the United States for a time when he was working for the U.S. government. Not all the sources, in fact, far from all the sources, are declassified, but I can tell you that he was giving them sensitive information on personnel, methods, that the United States didn't share with even its closest partners. Not Israel, not the United Kingdom, not Canada, not Australia, not the closest of the close. It had to keep that under wraps.
And the entire signal intelligence network of the United States as well, which wound up costing.
If the reports are to be believed, yes. Yeah. The damage was very strong. I don't think it was as strong. In fact, I know it was not as strong as the damage that was caused by spies like Rick Ames, Bob Hansen, John Walker of the Walker spy ring.
Who were spying for the Soviet Union, a hostile power, not just a curious, friendly power.
Yes. Even so, Pollard violated his oath. He did something very, very bad. It was criminal. He was tried. He was embroiled. He was first arrested trying to seek asylum at the Israeli embassy. He was subject to legal proceedings. Caspar Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense, submitted an affidavit to the court in which he outlined some of the damage that was done. It was claimed afterward that Weinberger exaggerated the damage. I can't weigh in on that debate because I don't know. Regardless, I can say that he did do a lot of damage to U.S. national security because we can't have people working in intelligence giving information to other countries in unsanctioned ways. That is not good. Pollard violated his oath. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, allegedly for violating the terms of his plea agreement by Judge Aubrey Robinson in the District of Columbia. And after decades, he was allowed to go free, and then he was also allowed, the terms of his parole were changed so that he could leave the country, and he's now settled in Israel. He's not a hero. He was a traitor if you're an American. The Israelis may have a different view. My view is, even though his motivations were not to spy for hostile power, his motivations, he was not a communist, he was not going to the Soviets and giving our enemy intelligence, he still compromised a lot of U.S. national security interests by doing so. It wasn't the proper way to help Israel. As others have said, he could have made Aliyah. He could have gone to Israel. He could have stopped working for the U.S. government. It wouldn't have been a problem. He wouldn't have been embroiled in legal proceedings. He wouldn't have committed any crimes. But he didn't, and he did take money for his services. The Israelis, for their part, were embarrassed by this. It was very embarrassing for them. And it also harmed, at least temporarily, the intelligence sharing relationship between Israel and the United States, which was bad both for Israel and the United States. As time went on, though, both sides decided to the Americans decided to let bygones be bygones. I remember coming across this one quote, I think, from Bob Gates, in which he said something to the effect of, "We're grown-ups. We let bygones be bygones. We're big boys. We understand that this stuff happens, and we're not going to let it interfere with the progress. We're not going to let it interfere with our shared interests and with the greater strategic partnership, because those things are much more important than the damage the Pollard did, and we're not going to let that
affair."
Again,
the same thesis that runs through your book, that this is about strategic interests. I think that's very true. But of course, it also, for a long time, really compromised the ability of American Jews working within the Defense Department and the Pentagon, and set off a long search by some people in the FBI, for this white whale of another Israeli spy that was largely mythical. That's another part of this that is both tragic and was damaging.
Yes. Bottom line, Pollard should not be lionized, certainly not by Americans, not a sympathetic figure, a bad guy, in my view. But again, this was one of the low points in the relationship. We're now 40 years after Pollard was arrested, and the affair, though not forgotten, is not a defining moment in the relationship. It was a negative point, and we should acknowledge that, and I do in the book, but I don't think that is the core of what the strategic partnership has been about.
Right. Now, the George H.W. Bush administration is the last one you cover in your book. Why was its relationship so fractious, and how did the alliance recover from that tension?
Remember that H.W. was Reagan's vice president. He succeeded Reagan. He won the presidential election in '88, defeating Michael Dukakis, who unfortunately had gone into a tank and had worn this hat, and it offered the Bush campaign, it was a gift because the guy just looked absolutely ridiculous. Bush campaigned as being a strong national security conservative, and Dukakis was tarred, rightly in my view, as a weak on crime, weak liberal. Dukakis lost, Bush won. Bush comes up to office in January of '89 with a slightly different view of Israel than Reagan. Reagan was a Zionist at his core. He strongly sympathized with Israel, even when he knew he needed to implement tough measures against it because American interests demanded he do. He was always a strong Zionist, and he spoke very warmly about Israel. Bush really didn't have that. The relationship was colder. It was less emotional. It was less sentimental, and it was really rooted in hard interests. Bush still wanted to maintain the security partnership, but not unconditionally. He, like other presidents, really prioritized an Arab-Israeli settlement. He convened this Madrid conference, I think it was in 1992, and really invested a lot of his political and diplomatic capital into bringing the Arabs and Israelis together. Like Carter, he often found the Israelis to be intransigent. He didn't appreciate some of their demands. There's a famous meeting between Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir and President Bush toward the beginning of Bush's presidency. Both were men of the right. Both were strong conservatives, and yet they did not get along very well at all. Bush asked Shamir about these so-called settlements in the West Bank, and Shamir said something to the effect of, "Oh, they will not be a problem." Bush interpreted that to mean there will be no more building in the West Bank. Shamir didn't. And when more construction happened, Bush felt personally wronged. Bush was somebody who put a lot of value in interpersonal diplomacy. He thought Shamir had misled him, had lied to him, and the relationship could never recover after that. It was always strained because of that one incident. Do you want me to talk about
Bush and his Secretary of State, James Baker, also bitterly resented AIPAC and pro-Israel forces in the United States. That created a lot of tension and actually led to the lowest vote when he ran for re-election of pretty much any Republican, in the last century.
Yes, Clinton in 92 won a staggeringly high share of the Jewish vote, and Bush, by extension, a staggeringly low share. Whereas in 80 and 84, Reagan had done very well.
And even,
Jews,
even in 88, George H.W. Bush did pretty well, more than even that Trump did in either election.
Yes, largely a carryover from the high points
Reagan,
of the Reagan years. Yes. Bush, probably, I think Carter was definitely much more hostile to Israel than Bush was. But Bush, for his part, he was not warmly disposed toward Israel. It was a cold, largely unsentimental relationship. It was based on national interests, national security, and Bush often thought the Israelis were being a hindrance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, there was the famous James Baker quote about Jews not voting for them and for his administration. So, yes. Famously.
And I do want to focus on one key episode from the Bush years, which was the Gulf War. As you remember.
Yes, I did want to get to that, which is, and I think you make a really interesting point that I don't know that I've seen made elsewhere, that you seem to argue, and based on obviously your research, it's backed up, that one of the reasons why the Bush administration did go to war to, sort of recover Kuwait from after it had been invaded and taken over by Saddam Hussein was that they saw it as essential to promoting, this grand scheme of Middle East peace involving Israel. Not so much, about that they cared about the Kuwaitis, but because they saw it as part of the peace process that they cared so much about.
Certainly, they viewed the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, the invasion of an Arab country by another Arab country, as detrimental to their regional ambitions. They did, as you say, want to strike a grand bargain, a big Arab-Israeli settlement. Obviously, if you have one Arab country invading another and occupying it, that's not going to be good for American grand strategy. Where Israel came in, though, was after the invasion happens, and as the Americans and the multinational coalition are attempting to liberate Kuwait from Iraq's clutches, is Saddam Hussein, in response, starts lobbing Scud missiles Israel's way. Saddam really feared this multinational coalition that was attempting to liberate Kuwait, and he wanted to expand the war. There were actually Arab forces in the multinational coalition. Saddam thought that in provoking the Israelis into attacking, he could actually make this just another Arab-Israeli war. Then it would be politically impossible for the rest of the Arab world to support the U.S.-led efforts to liberate Kuwait, and that would complicate things. This was a nightmare scenario for Bush and his people. He did not want Israel to get involved. He thought it would be calamitous for American interests. And before and after Scud missile attacks were being launched against Israel, he pressured the Israelis heavily not to intervene. There was enormous pressure on the Israelis. Shamir writes about this in his memoirs. He said something along the lines of, "It went against my grain as an Israeli, as a Zionist, not to retaliate against such brazen attacks on our people, against our sovereignty, but the Americans were pulling out all the stops to ensure that we did not do so." And to the administration's credit, if you're looking at results, it managed to avoid Israeli retaliation, and there was no wider Arab-Israeli conflict. There certainly was damage in Israel. I think a few people died indirectly. There was damage to property. But in the grand scheme of things, it could have been worse, and it was not as traumatic a moment in Israeli history as some others that we've seen. Certainly, psychologically, it was jarring, but in terms of damage, it was not as bad as it could have been otherwise.
Yeah. I think it set an unfortunate precedent, which I think subsequent Israeli governments have not been quite eager not to repeat. Now, your book doesn't extend to the present, but what lessons from the Cold War era best explain, do you think, what has happened under both the Biden and the Trump administrations as we continue to have this dance between U.S. and Israeli interests and, the belief that there's more here than just interests?
For those of us who think that a strong U.S.-Israel partnership redounds to American interests, I do think that. I imagine you do, Jonathan, as well as most of your viewers. We should not focus on what I would call the window dressing, the fluff, the arguments that we are two countries with shared history, shared values. We love that there are gay pride parades in Tel Aviv and other places, for example. We love that Israel is a liberal society. Those things may be good, and we may celebrate that. But what really matters to the American government, what really matters to the politicians and the officials who are making these decisions are hard American interests. Frankly, it doesn't matter to us all that much if there are gay pride parades in Tel Aviv and if Israel is a liberal democratic society. What really matters to us is Israel's power and whether it's aligned with us on these key questions. Today, Israel is undeniably powerful. It's got a very large economy considering its size. It's got a very large military budget considering its size, and it's arguably the most powerful country in the Middle East. In fact, I would submit that it is. It's very advantageous for the United States to have a close relationship with a country like that. Again, you want to have powerful countries on your side. The weaker a country is, the less value it is to you. That is a very strong case that I think resonates with a lot of Americans. We respect power. We want powerful countries to be on our side. We are the most powerful country on earth, and the more powerful friends we have, the better for us. Again, I would say to those of you who often make the argument along those flowery, abstract, kind of esoteric lines, I wonder how effective that is going to be. I think a much more effective case is being cold, detached, dispassionate, and looking at the facts, looking at the numbers, and making that case. That, I think, is much more persuasive to some people who might otherwise be less inclined to support a strong U.S.-Israel partnership.
Yeah, well, I think realism actually is the most realistic argument for a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. I think that's been proven, and frankly, under the Trump administration. I think that's the inevitable conclusion. Well, Daniel, thanks so much for joining us today, and I do recommend your book to our viewers and listeners. It's scholarly in nature, but it provides a very good understanding of an often misunderstood topic, as well as a good read.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure, and here's a copy of my book in case your viewers are interested. Thanks again for having me, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure and a delight to speak with you today.
We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on any one of the various podcast platforms or watching us live on Facebook or on X or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself. And thanks again to our sponsors, the Jewish Future Promise. Sign the promise at jewishfuturepromise.org/signthepromise.